You feeling stuck lately? Like life's passing you by? Get to know M.A.Y.A.
Acronym My Ambition, Your Ambition.
Reconnect with your dreams, your goals, your ambitions. Find your motivation and start to live the life you desire. Explore the M.A.Y.A. My Ambition, Your Ambition podcast at M.A.Y.A.Akai.com.
Namaste, everyone. Welcome to M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition. This is episode 35, which totally is just building momentum from episode 34, because I felt like it was one of those conversations that was long overdue. And I've had it with a couple people recently in regards to knowing your boundaries. And it's a conversation that most people have, but don't think to actually do any follow through with it. So I'm looking forward to this episode because I think it'll be enlightening. You'll get some insight from it. So before we jump into, obviously, the episode, we have to do our housekeeping, things we always do. So make sure you listen to M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition at M.A.Y.A.Akai.com. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel, M.A.Y.A.Akai. But of course, if you happen to have a podcast platform that you prefer, okay, I won't hold it against you. You can always go to iTunes, Google, iHeartRadio. I'm on Amazon Audible, Spotify, pretty much on most podcast platforms. You can find M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition. You got to put the whole thing in order to find me. Hopefully by now you are getting social with me, which means you are following me on Instagram and Twitter, M.A.Y.A_Akai, and Facebook, M.A.Y.A Akai Presents, are all the ways that you can keep up with what I'm going on today. Miriam McQueen will not be with us today. She's actually on Easter break, so she has the day off. But, you know, she's the M.A.Y.A musical muse. So make sure you follow Miriam on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those things at Miriam McQueen. You can always find her music. iTunes, Spotify, all those places you can find music. You can find Miriam's stuff there as well. And we will have one of her songs, her original songs that she's recorded, on the back end of the show. So we'll still have some Miriam McQueen as part of the show. Of course, if you are a first-time listener, welcome. As I always say, buckle up for safety, not because this isn't a safe space, but I may say something that may make you really kind of go, wow, I never thought of it that way. So it's kind of like sometimes it's the element of surprise in conversation that you're not prepared for. If you are a returning listener or viewer, then you know the drill. I always tell you, find that space where you can be comfortable, you can tune in, grab a piece of paper, a pencil and pen. You might want to jot down something that kind of pops in your head to kind of review it later on in the show. There's always podcast resources. So when you go to M.A.Y.A.Akai.com, you can just go to the podcast resource tab, click there, episode 35. I have some supplemental things that I will share with you to kind of expand the conversation beyond what I talk about in the podcast today. So there was all the way that you can get involved with the show. Now, I will tell you, get your beverage of your choice. For me, I'm double-fisted today. I'm doing coffee, but I'm also drinking water. I'm trying to be far more hydrated. So I'm doing coffee, but it's 5 o'clock somewhere. So if you have a glass of wine, if you have a beer, whatever helps you to get comfortable when you're listening to the podcast, totally works for me. Happy opening day, as you see me in my White Sox jersey. Today is the opening day of baseball, so I'm super excited about this because baseball is my favorite sport, and I've been waiting for this all year. So I'm excited it's opening day, and if you happen to be a baseball enthusiast as I am, you're probably equally excited, especially if you have a team that you feel like is really going to be in the hunt this year. So happy baseball opening day to everybody. Now, another way to get engaged in the show, and people do it very frequently. Roburn always joins the show and shares the show, which I greatly appreciate. You can comment on Facebook or you can comment on the YouTube page. And whatever you say, I can share it to the viewing audience. Of course, I have to read it to just people who are listening, but that's a way you can get interactive with the show and share your thoughts. If I say something that kind of sparks a memory or you have something you want to share in regards to your thoughts on what I'm saying, you can always put it in the comment section. And just like I did with Roburn, I can share what you're saying. And he says, "Hola, Hama." He lives in Hawaii, I do believe. So hence he always says hello. Hello to you too. Welcome and thank you for joining. And I appreciate you supporting the show and sharing it. As much as I always say, M.A.Y.A probably isn't for everybody. I'm going to say that. It's not everybody's cup of tea or coffee because people don't really like to talk about mental health or mental wellness until they're in a bind or a buckle. Then all of a sudden, everybody wants to seek the support. And some people are even reluctant to seek support even when they need it. So I understand this topic of mental wellness that I approach to do on a weekly basis, Thursdays, 2 p.m. Central Time, isn't the thing that draws people in. But I may say something that you can use, or you may know somebody else who's in a difficult space and they may find some value. So feel free to share, obviously, M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition on your pages and encourage people to listen to the show if you think this is something they can get from it. Because as we know, this last year has been very difficult for people with the pandemic. pandemic. I always say the 3 C's were challenges: comfort, convenience, and control. And people are really struggling what to do with it. And I'm going to tell you something. Even though the world is sort of opening up and there's going to be a new norm, I work in the mental health field. I've been doing that for 20 plus years. I'm a counselor. So I don't just do this. I don't just jump on Facebook and say, hey guys, I just want to talk about mental wellness with you. I'm technically a qualified professional in what I do. I'm going to tell you, you would think with the world opening up, you would think with the weather getting better outside, that people would kind of start to move past anxiety and depression. I'm actually seeing an increase. I'm actually seeing more outcomes in regards to depression and anxiety than I thought I would come this time of the year. And there was a really interesting study that was in the process that's being done by Northwestern University. And it's called long COVID. They gave another name for it, but that was kind of the layman term, long COVID study, which means people who have had COVID. And they're now kind of researching what's kind of been the effects after you've gotten over COVID. We frequently hear about fatigue, that people say they really struggle with kind of getting back to where they were. You hear a lot of professional athletes talk about they just don't seem to be back at the top of their game when they've had COVID. Well, what this long COVID study that Northwestern is kind of beginning to pull apart is that there's also residual depression and anxiety, fatigue, brain fog are some of the things that people are experiencing that had COVID. So if you're someone who had COVID, or you know someone who has had COVID, and it seems that they're not themselves, you may want to have the conversation and say, hey, did you talk to your doctor about if you feel like your memory's poor, you feel kind of like foggy sometimes, or you're feeling depressed or more anxious after you've had COVID? There's a study that's saying right now that there are some after effects of having COVID. Maybe you should check in with your primary physician to see if there's something you can do to kind of feel better. So just wanted to share that information with you, that if you've had COVID, there actually can be some depression, anxiety, fatigue, and brain fog that could be lingering well past the 90 days that the antibody stays in your system. So, all right, on to episode 35. And I'm going to really enjoy this because after last week, I had on Yanni Brown. We really talked about intimacy and some other things. And I brought Yanni Brown on. As you know, she is a author, Making Love Better, and then Making Love Better Together. She's a relationship, a intimacy expert. There are areas I like to bring in other people because I feel a lot of times we struggle with things, boundaries being one and intimacy being something else. And we often don't know how to seek help for it because we're kind of embarrassed. No one wants to say, for instance, that, oh, I have poor boundaries, or I don't think I even have boundaries, so to speak, or I'm having issues in my relationship and that intimacy. And by the way, as we talked about last week, intimacy is just not about actual sexual intercourse. I know, so adult, big words. It's really about the connection you have emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually with that person and how it evolves over time in your respective relationships. People often don't want to acknowledge when perhaps there's a red flag or something is wrong. And when they do, it might have gone too far because they didn't address their intimacy issues. Often, from the very beginning, people don't actually acknowledge boundaries. So before we jump in to talk about boundaries, what's our standard thing? We put our toolbox on the table. And what do we always take out of a toolbox? I say, hey, everybody, get your EI out, get your EI out, your emotional intelligence. That's your ability to perceive, control, and evaluate emotions, your emotions as well as other people's emotions. Emotional intelligence is the most important tool you can have in your toolbox. And everything about M.A.Y.A is that day-to-day work towards being that best version of yourself. It's that day-to-day work of achieving and maintaining happiness. Because what people don't understand, and what I find, especially in the scope of my work of being a counselor, is that people don't really think about happiness from a day-to-day perspective. They don't think about being that best version of yourself as a day-to-day endeavor. If people would think about themselves, mind you, depending upon what your mindset is on this, the way you give consideration to material things like houses and cars and clothes, how you take care of those things, you make sure they're properly taken care of, serviced, laundered, all those things. If we took that same focus and put it on ourselves, we would have a much richer life because we are the most important asset that we have. And often we undermine ourselves by not giving ourselves that kind of attention and credit and care that we need. Hence, you hear more things in this current society about self-care and self-advocacy, because we're trying to get people to rethink and see themselves as the most valuable asset that they have in their life. That's what M.A.Y.A is all about. So, you know the rule of the podcast is this might be episode 35. But if you're still back in episode 19, I don't have a problem with it because some episodes may run deeper with you than others. There may be a certain amount of gravity that talking about communication skills has with you versus maybe talking about depression, so to speak. Maybe you're not depressed, but maybe you're struggling in those areas that are keeping you from being that best version of yourself. So remember, you work at your own pace here, especially if you're a first-time listener and you just jumped into 35. I would greatly encourage you, not just because I think that I'm forward-thinking and I think, things in a different perspective, but I really do feel that past episodes really they build upon each other, and it creates this roadmap that can really help you focus on being that best version of yourself. So if you're jumping in at 35, it's not like you're going to be lost in the process, but I think the process, you will get more value from it if you go back to episode 1 and listen through. That would be my advice. So this is not a counseling session. I'm your mental wellness advocate. That's how I always tell people. It's about mental wellness. It's about me being like it's like life is a game, and I'm your life coach, and I'm trying to help you get to that better place. That's how I want you to see our relationship when you tune in every single week. Okay, so you've got your E.A.I on the table. You should always have your objectivity and subjectivity. And actually, we really want you to really have more of objectivity on the table than subjectivity, because remember, that's what we're moving away from. Seeing things only from our perspective subjectively, opposed to being objective and seeing things for a larger view and opening up our lens, opening up that f-stops for all my photographers and people like that are out there. It's key that you understand that the tools we're working on is emotional intelligence, objectivity, and now understanding things like boundaries. So now that we've had our toolbox moment, let's jump in and let's talk about healthy relationships cannot exist without boundaries. And their absence often results in chaos, confusion, and a habitual cycle of unhappiness. I'm going to tell you that. Because we don't really think about boundaries, though boundaries exist in almost every aspect of your life. You see boundaries in the day-to-day operations of life. I'll give you an example. In sports, there are boundaries. If it's a football field, you have, obviously, this is the boundary. If you step out of line, the ball's no longer in play. In baseball, the lines around the field, it's a foul ball if it goes past that line. It's a boundary. Boundaries exist in every aspect of life, and some we clearly identify. But often when it comes to boundaries of our personal life, the relationship we have with ourselves and others, they're not as a clear demarcation point as they are in sports and other things that we understand, like thresholds of like how much money you can put into your 401k annually. There's a limit. There's a boundary. So when we talk about personal boundaries, they're not as clear cut. And I think that's where people struggle, and they don't put it into a framework because it just doesn't seem as obvious as others. So, I like to be very literal with things. Let's talk about what exactly is a boundary. So we have a framework that we're working with. So a boundary, by definition, if you just were to look it up, I'm being straight from like the Merriam-Webster's, dictionary online. It's something that indicates bounds or limits. Limiting or bounding lines, which means there's a construct to something. There's a limit. There's a point where this is where enough is enough and should not go past this. Danger, Will Robinson, danger. That's what boundaries are. It's when you've gotten to a point where too much is too much. And I'll be honest, there's even low limit boundaries where, especially when you are working on getting out of your comfort zone, boundaries are key, because when you understand your boundaries, you know exactly when you dipped your toe in the water and you're like, oh, it's really cold. Okay, I'm gonna just jump in. But you realize that you're not jumping in and you can't swim. So there's boundaries to everything. This show is about helping you to understand personal boundaries. So we're talking about things as indicated by bounds or limits, limiting or bounding lines. Just think about that when we talk about the different realms of boundaries. So note this too about boundaries. Boundaries exist, like I said, in almost every facet in our lives. So why do we fail to employ them in our personal relationships? So if you see them at work, you see them in sports, you even see them, probably in certain relationships. Some people show you their boundaries, but you probably don't identify them that way. So the question is, why do we so easily not notice personal boundaries of others, but especially ourselves? Keep that in the back of your mind as we're rolling through this conversation. So Real Talk Time 1, and we're only going to have maybe 1 or 2 in the show. This one isn't too heavy with real talk, even though everything about it's real talk. But the Real Talk Time moments in the show this is when, if you're jotting something down, but this is the thing I want you to really chew on, pay attention to. So why are boundaries often negated? Because the first thing when we talk about, we see boundaries, everything in life, speed limits. It's a boundary. You can only go this fast before now you've broken the law. See what I mean? There are limits and boundaries to everything. So now before we dive into understanding your boundaries, and maybe you might say, oh, I don't know that I have boundaries. You do. You probably just have never identified them. But let's talk about first why boundaries are often negated. There are some patterns of behavior for people that have poor boundaries with others or with themselves. 1, can't say no. 2, they frequently override their needs to please other people. They're people pleasers. They know nothing about reciprocity and balance. So it's always yes to somebody else, and they don't ever think about themselves, even though they know they have needs and wants. 3, they're often dealing with somebody that's demanding, controlling, criticizing, or pushy. So because of that, they don't know how to work within boundaries because they're dealing with somebody who clearly has none, or they cross everybody's boundaries because they're comfortable with that. They don't care. This is how they want things to be. It's about what I want. It's about what I need. It's about what I have to get. So hence, they don't know how to strike the balance in their relationships with people. And this often can be because 1, they didn't learn it, or 2, it's their defense mechanism from in the past being taken advantage of. And now they might feel that I have to be firm, foot down to achieve what it is that I want. So hence, they'll step on everybody else's boundaries because they now feel that it's their time and they shouldn't have to make concessions for people. This goes back to that conversation that we have about knowing when to be selfish and knowing when to be selfless. That's a whole nother episode down the road. Who knows? It might be the next one. But real talk, you have to think about why you negate boundaries or why you don't have boundaries. And I guarantee you it may be one of these 3 things or a combination of these 3 things over your lifetime. So, boundaries are necessary. Just know this. Boundaries are necessary because individual needs versus just wants. You must set yours, but the key thing about boundary and learning them is that you must respect other people's boundaries. So you may put something in place for you, and if it doesn't quite resonate, you don't get just to step over somebody else's boundary because it doesn't work with your boundary. See, this is where balance has to learn how to be struck with people. This is where communication steps in. This is about a healthy relationship. So if you keep stepping over somebody else's boundary because it doesn't match your boundary, then you are not trying to facilitate a healthy relationship, whatever that person or whatever that situation is. You've just thrown caution away because it doesn't match you. And that becomes a big part of this conversation. I'm going to share a video that I always have people listen and reflect on. It's like a 4-minute video that I talk to people when I counsel them, and I say, this video is very insightful because though you and I can talk about it, I just feel it comes from a website called On Life Guide, and it was in their deep personal development section they were doing. And I said, when you listen to this video, I said, it will really kind of put things in perspective. And I guarantee you, you will have a aha moment with it. Because I could probably say exactly the same thing in the video, but people sometimes want to shut down when they're hearing something face to face, but it's easier when it's a siloed message that's controlled because you can listen and process it a bit differently without feeling that somebody's watching you process it. That's what kind of makes therapy or counseling awkward for people, because someone is watching to how you respond to be able to help you work through the process, because it's about being challenged to make the change that you want. So we're going to get into that a little bit later in the show. So boundaries are necessary. That means individual needs versus just wants play into this, but you must learn how to set your own. But key thing is you have to know how to respect other people's boundaries. Okay, let's step into our first toolbox time. And I think we only have 1 or 2 of these in this show. We're going to talk about boundaries, and then we're going to show the video, because I think everything I just said, and when I play that video, it just all kind of falls nicely into the bowl. It gets mixed and it's consistent. So let's talk about boundaries, because boundaries, there are 6 types, generally speaking, and we're going to talk about degrees to which they matter. These boundaries I'm talking about are literally the platform of the show. I say we work on the best version of you emotionally, mentally, physically, financially, spiritually. We work in all these domains that these boundaries exist in, and that's what's really key. So this should sort of resonate, and really it should be probably the biggest expansion part of this conversation in episode 35. I feel like this should be the thing that should pull all these other episodes together for you. So let's kind of break down what the different types of boundaries exist. So let's start with one that isn't, and by the way, these are not ranked by order of importance, just by the fact that they merely exist. I kind of want to start with one that I think people are the most familiar with. The first one is that financial or material boundary. And it's that boundary that determines whether you give or lend things such as your money, your car, clothes, books, even food. I know that sounds crazy. Now, when we talk about degrees to this, you have some people, for instance, that will let no one drive their car. And there's nothing wrong with that because they feel like the kind of financial investment they made in it, they're not going to just give that to someone. And if they do it with maybe some apprehension. Other people are like, oh, sure, you can use my car. But they may not say in a boundary, but I would hope you would bring it back if you drive the gas out. It's boundaries, small, but simple things. So everybody has degrees to things. So, for instance, some people don't like to share their clothes with other people. They don't want other people wearing their shoes. That's actually a boundary. You just don't like sharing certain things with people because you feel they're personal things that belong to you. Some people don't like to lend people money. Or, here's a big one. Some people will lend people money with sometimes the expectation, but they may never get the money back, especially if they've come to know the person. So they've already said, I know I'm going to lend this person money and they're not going to pay me back. And sometimes within their boundary, they'll tell them that. I know you told me you're going to pay me back, but chances are you're probably not because we've done this before. Or people have boundaries. I have lent you money before and you have not paid me back, so I'm done lending you money. That's a boundary. Within the scope of our relationship, I am not lending you money because I know you're not going to pay me back. So why create an issue with you with something I know is you're not going to do what you said? So why make it complicated within our respective relationship to expect you to do something that you're not going to do? So your boundary is you expect for someone to do what they say they're going to do. On the flip side, the other person's boundary may not be a person who has good follow through. They don't. So it's important to understand your boundary as well as the person you're interacting with. See how this kind of is a give and take thing, and you strike the balance by understanding it. So that financial and material boundary is key. I'm going to tell you something. This is a boundary that can come to be an issue specifically in relationships or marriages, especially if you have a person that you're with or married to who has family members who like to ask for money. You have some people that are not okay with that. Like, look, I am not the ATM for your family. Just because we're in a financially good place and we work hard to do this doesn't mean that we have to give them money. A great scenario came up in a talk show that my uncle was watching, and he happened to run it by me when we were chatting. And I said, well, this is probably why I'm single, because this is my mindset on this. The question that came up on this show, he lives in out east, so it was like a local talk show, was that this lady and this man were dating for like 2 years. They were talking about moving in together, and they actually were going to get engaged, but they weren't there yet. The guy had been unemployed for about 9 months and wasn't working, but obviously he was able to sustain in some way, and she wasn't necessarily supplementing him anyway. His mother passes away, and he came to her and asked her for $10,000. And she was struggling with it because within her boundary, she didn't feel comfortable giving that kind of money for that situation, despite the fact that they're in a relationship. It just went past her financial boundary of comfort. She said, if we were married, there'd be no question this is something we'd have to do. She goes, but we are not a union that way. And I feel he is asking too much of me, but I feel she understands his boundary. He was comfortable enough asking her for the money. She's like, but I feel if I say no, this will absolutely destroy our relationship. It's complicated. You see that boundary issue? And this is why when you're dating someone, especially in the beginning to understand their boundaries on a lot of things, even financial things, listening to what they tell you is really important. So that's a big one that often can have ebbs and flows in people's lives that can be complicated, especially when it comes to money. A secondary boundary, a physical boundary. And this is pertains to personal space a lot, privacy, including your body, handshakes, hugs, when and with who are you comfortable about that? Nudity, locked doors, and how you sit in the room. I remember I worked with a couple people that absolutely could not sit with their back to the door. And it turns out that was related to a situation that they had been in. Because I was like, they're like, can I switch seats with you? And I was like, why? They're like, I can't see with my back to the door. It bothers me. It was a boundary they had about space. They needed to see the full room, everybody who was in it, and who came in the door. And I was like, Okay, because that wasn't a boundary for me. It wasn't a big deal. Um, you see boundaries if you go to health clubs and work out. It's a locker room, so people walk around. Sometimes you have some people who have no issue with body, so they walk around absolutely naked, and you have other people who are like clothed up, has a towel, will not show themselves because their personal boundary with nudity is they're not comfortable with it, and sometimes they're not comfortable with other people, but they do realize within that space a person has a right to do that, and they can't really say anything about it. Here's another thing that I will tell you can be complicated about physical boundaries. Handshakes, hugs, you never really know where people are at with that. So you should never kind of feel offended if someone won't shake your hand or give you a hug because that's a boundary they have. It's got nothing to do with you. And sometimes people get really offended, like, they didn't want to shake my hand. Sometimes there's a cultural implication where people will not shake your hand. I remember I had a client that had come in through the emergency department, and he was Middle Eastern. And when the situation was done, just by kind of this was before COVID, I went to shake his hand, and he looked at me, and then I realized, oh, it's a cultural thing. I said, oh, I'm sorry, no problem. He goes, no. I'm like, no, you don't have to explain. I just didn't think about it. It's like a kind of a common thing. Generally, most of my clients shake my hand. I'm not offended. I totally understand this. And he was like, thank you. I was fine with it. It was an understanding of a boundary, but he was ready to explain it to me if I didn't know, which would have been okay too. So don't always take it as a personal thing. Sometimes a person doesn't like to be hugged because they may have had a background that involves trauma. So that close proximity of people they really don't know sometimes make them uncomfortable. People struggle with this. So be mindful. If you try to do something and someone kind of backs away, don't take it personal. It's something about their boundary that prevents them from being able to have that exchange with you. So just know that you may be a very open person, huggy, kissy, let's kumbaya, and that's okay, but that's you. And you should never be offended if somebody else can't meet you at that space of that personal proximity space. So that's a key thing to always keep in mind, especially in professional work environments, that sometimes it's not appropriate and sometimes people don't like it. And it doesn't mean that, it's anything about you. So that physical proximity. I would also tell you this in regards to physical boundaries that kind of fall into conversation a bit. I'm one of those people that I don't particularly like when I first meet somebody. In regards to a dating aspect, if out the gates he starts talking about sexual things to me, it instantly turns me off. It goes past a boundary with me. I'm like, I don't even know you. I don't even know your favorite color. I don't know, if you put cream in your coffee and this is where you're going in a conversation with me, it makes me uncomfortable. It's not a boundary I like cross with people that I don't know. So for me, that's a boundary in a talk space. When I get to know people, I believe there's a time and generally a place for not everything, but when things should be unfolded. And I think before you forge forward and jump into a sexual conversation with someone you don't know, you should make sure they're okay with it. Because one, again, you don't know a person's personal history. There could be something trauma related, and you jumping into this sexual conversation with them may kind of throw them back or, really kind of put them in a bad space because they're uncomfortable with it. They have to learn to be comfortable with you to even begin to maybe to have that type of conversation. I don't have that kind of trauma. I'm just the kind of person, I don't particularly care for it. It's a boundary that I have. So just be mindful in conversation too, and certain topics when it comes to privacy and body as well, that personal space, I'm going to put the talk space in there as well. A third boundary is that mental boundary. And these are this is the unseen. It's the intangible that people don't think about. That mental boundary entails thoughts, values, and opinions. Do you know what you believe to even have a boundary? Are you familiar with your core values? It's an episode down the road. Core values become your driving force between most things you do. You can have strong core values, or you might have weak as hell core values. It just depends. And it's going to influence your actions. I'm just going to say that. So can you hold your opinion? Can you listen with an open mind? I just had a situation last weekend where I was having a conversation about relationship dynamics within the Black community. And I was talking to one gentleman, and this other man, who I felt was very aggressive, jumped in the conversation and got really in my personal space. Now, mind you, I said, I don't think we should be having this conversation right now because there's libations involved, and I think it's really easy for this to go off the rails. But he was pushy, and I didn't like that he wanted to discount the fact that I was sharing my experience was positive. It did have some hiccups about how I was actually raised to see my concept and construct of men was respectful. It wasn't negative, though I came from a single family home. My mother did not speak poorly of my father. He wanted to discount my experience because he felt, because somehow he was the, ultimate fact finder, that that's your experience. That doesn't speak to what other people have. And I was like, hold up, bro. I didn't say that was somebody's experience. First, you should talk from your own experience and not assume that something is homogenous. That's dangerous thinking. He had dangerous thinking. And I got to the point where I had to get up and leave the table because I was having bad thoughts. I was like, okay, he's pushing my buttons because I don't like when people, one, he's in my personal space. He was really close to me and he was being aggressive. And I happen to be a person, I can be aggressive. I can be verbally aggressive with people. Like, I don't back down. I'm not shy. I will stand my ground. I respect other people's opinions. And I kept trying to say, I get what you're saying. What I'm not saying my experience becomes the litmus test for everyone. I'm just saying I work from my position, but I also, because in my scope of my job, I've come across a lot of people's pain and heartache. So I totally get this. I couldn't even get to it because he was so aggressive, and then got mad when I said he was aggressive. And I was like, you know what? I exited the conversation at that point. And if I came back and he was still there, I was going to be like, you weren't even invited to the conversation, so I need you to leave the table. I would have told him that, seriously. So I'm very open-minded. I can stand my ground. I know my mental boundaries with people. And I'm the kind of person, when I get really mad, I start to want to cry. Like, my anger wells up in me like that. Seriously. I'll be like, ooh, I think that was my tantrum from being an only child. But I'm a very passionate, empathic person. I feel people's pain. And the thing is, I could actually feel where he was coming from, but it was his energy with me that was really not doing well. So be mindful of people's energy and how it impacts your mental boundaries. That's really key. And the emotional and mental boundary kind of go hand in hand, truth be told. Because that emotional boundary is being able to separate your emotions and responsibilities for them from someone else's. Because healthy boundaries prevent you from giving advice, blaming, or accepting blame. And in that situation I just described, I wasn't blaming anybody. I was sharing my experience and could totally understand theirs. And I was trying to see, though we differ in our experience, we have a common goal of what we were trying to say we wanted to achieve respectfully within the community. But there was this anger piece that was totally coming up, and it was aggravating me. So that it's interesting being able to have that. Remember, we say one of the other big things that we put in our toolbox here at M.A.Y.A is responding versus reacting. So opposed to me really, like I said, wanting to be Peter Popoff and show him a whole side of me that he didn't know I have, I got up and I walked away, because I didn't want to respond and have to say some nasty things to him. I'm like, yes, you are aggressive. And I meant that. And he was. I was like, but beyond kind of like then just throwing words and playing the dozens with somebody, because now we've hit a point where we're not even listening. I just left the situation. That's having control of your emotions. That's what's important. Even when you're angry. Anger is the easiest emotion to elicit. And knowing when you need to get up and walk away is really important. I got up and walked away. And trust me, I was hot. I was mad. I'm serious. But I was like, I'm gonna go. And it was funny because when I walked away, a person came behind me and said, I just want you to know I totally agree with what you're saying. And the problem is he's like that in every conversation. He thinks he's always right and never wants to listen to anybody. And he was totally pissed because you were challenging him. I said, well, that could have gone wrong, but thank you. I didn't need the validation, but it just also let me know he has a pattern of behavior that's like that. Knowing people is key. So then you don't go past your boundary, because now you kind of understand theirs. And those emotional boundaries are really important. You don't have to give advice. Sometimes you just listen. You don't have to blame people for something, but more importantly, you don't have to accept the blame or minimize your experience. That's the one thing I want people to really begin to understand. Your experience is yours. And you never have to minimize it because it doesn't match someone else's or they don't think it's valid. Because first of all, no one has a right to judge your life. If you happen to have a life that wasn't necessarily bad, you might have had some hiccups. No one has a right to make you feel as if your experience has no value in the grand scheme of how things progress through everyday life or with other people or within a respective community. Everyone's not destitute. There are some people who have had some adverse situations and have risen up and can share that. So don't let anybody ever make you feel, especially if you really haven't had this difficult or hard life, oh, what are you complaining about? Look, don't minimize somebody else's experiences because your burden was different. Everybody has their own burden, and nobody's burden is more important than somebody else's. It's what we do with our burden that matters. It's how we handle it. It's how we lift it. It's where we put it. Do we stick it in a bag and keep carrying it with us? That's what matters. So never let someone minimize how you feel because it doesn't match how they feel, or they think how they feel is more important. The minute you see that behavior in somebody, you might want to be putting an exit strategy together, because that's not healthy. Well, I had this happen to me and you don't understand it. You're right, I don't. And I didn't say that I did. But why are you trying to make me a bad person because I didn't have that experience? I'm listening to you. I'm empathetic, not sympathetic. I hear what you're saying. People struggle when people have healthy responses to their negative situations. People struggle with that big time. Think about that. Seriously, think about that. Another boundary is that sexual boundary. And I kind of touched about this a bit earlier. Sexual boundaries is where you feel your comfort level is with sexual talk, touch, and activity. It includes what, where, when, and with whom you feel it's appropriate. I kind of talked about this within that physical dynamic too, because it's a physical realm, because talk can exist in a physical space. But the sexual boundaries, some people feel because they're provocative or they're provocateurs, that they can just be that way around everybody. I'll be honest, I am like the nerdiest. Absolutely. Hello, Nubia Kata. Yes, I'm glad you agree about not letting people minimize your experience because that's not healthy. But I'm a very shy, rather, I'm introverted and extroverted at the same time. I think it's a weird thing, but I have both of those qualities. And I'm the kind of person that I'm not a big sex talker. I really don't like people talking to me about it. I was like, don't talk about it, be about it. Why are we talking about it? If we're going to do it, when we do it over here. I don't need you that in my face unless we have that kind of relationship and I've developed that comfort level with you. But you have some people who come out the gates just like bam, bam, like just saying stuff. And I'm looking at them like, no, no. I'm sure you telling me you thought I had nice breast was a compliment. But if that's the only thing you saw when you looked at me, which it might have been, but I'm not flattered by that. And everyone's not flattered with sexual advances. But we live in a society that everybody has become, a lot of people, not everybody, thinks that being provocative is the thing. If that's you, that's you. But I also think you should respect other people's boundaries. So if you know you're in a space where you're around a lot of Christian people, don't walk in being the provocateur if you've been invited in, because that's not them. And it doesn't mean you're minimizing yourself. You're just respecting the space that you're in, just like someone should respect your space. But a lot of people don't think like that. They think it's about me and why should I have to modify who I am. In some situations in life, you are going to modify yourself to kind of work through a situation. At work, this is why people get in trouble at work. You can't go in being 100 and just being you all the time, because that might compromise your job, because it may not be appropriate being you. Cursing people out, if that's you outside with family and friends, if that's how you are, you drop it like that, that's great. Go to work cursing people out, guess what? Might get you fired. Going to work, talking sexually, being provocative, might get you in trouble and can get you fired. You might have had one job where the culture was totally like that, where people were, talkative or flirty, suggestive, and everybody did it. You go to a new space or a new person gets introduced into your environment and they're not comfortable with it. And this is where sexual harassment comes in, because they're like, I didn't like that they were talking. It made me uncomfortable. And I know people think that's not fair. It doesn't matter. It's about boundaries. And when you're in a workspace, you're in a shared space with people, which means you need to respect other people's boundaries. That's key. So the sexual boundaries can be blurred very easily, but I think it's important when you're dealing with people, especially in new relationships, you should probably get to learn their sexual boundaries. This is where I was talking about this with Yanni Brown last week when she was on my show. If you're a person that's highly sexual, big sex drive, like to have sex all the time, you like to try new things, you probably shouldn't partner yourself up with somebody who you might deem to be a prude. Okay, you might think, oh, it's a challenge. Maybe I can get them to do something. If it's not their boundary, if they're going to tell you, I'm not going to be able to get down with you, 50 Shades of Grey is not my thing. No, don't waste your time and don't waste theirs, because you're going to frustrate each other. Seriously. So just be mindful of people's boundaries. If they don't match, you may have to keep that in mind. And then there's that spiritual boundary. And everybody's not spiritual. And I get that. So I'm not pushing this on you. But if this is something that happens to resonate with you, that spiritual boundary is related to your beliefs and experiences in connection with God or a higher power, and how you relate and respond to it, in different spiritual constructs. You don't have a right, if someone is a different religion, to look down at somebody else's religion. I happen to practice Buddhism. And I don't say I'm a Buddhist because I don't feel like I've earned the right to say that yet. There's so much more I have to learn. But Buddhism is a philosophy. It's not a religion, but people think that it is. I love the philosophy of it. It really helps you to get to that best version of yourself, those daily challenges. I love Buddhism. I'm Catholic by being baptized. The talk I get about being Catholic kind of makes me laugh. But once I was on a retreat with people who were Jehovah's Witnesses, and I was like the only person who wasn't there. It was a ski trip. Somebody had invited me. And when somebody had mentioned like, oh, well, what temple are you from? I'm like, oh, I'm not a Jehovah's Witness. And they're like, the room looked like, she's not a Jehovah's Witness. And then it was like, oh, well, what faith are you? And I said the dirty word. I said, I'm Catholic. Oh, I became like the scourge of the ski trip. By the way, I really didn't give a damn, because that ski trip turned to get so turned up and so out of control. I was like, oh, and they're turning their nose up at me because I'm Catholic, and they're over there doing inappropriate stuff based on their own religious beliefs. Bye, Felicia. Anyways, so you should never judge someone else from the path they've chosen. And before you think you understand a religion, like everybody thinks they understand Islam, they don't. It's not all this militant and craziness that we think we see on TV or in incidents. It's a very peaceful religion. And there's different sects of Islam, just like there's different sects of Judaism. And obviously Christianity has an umbrella of Protestants and Catholics and Lutherans. Get to know other religions, and you'll find the tenets are very similar at the core of what it's about. So the spirituality piece. So once we talked about the 6 different types, which is important to know, I want you to ask yourself why it's hard to set boundaries. Okay. Real talk time 2. Boundaries are learned, and a lack of acknowledging yours and others is often unintentional. If you put others' needs and feelings first, if you don't know what makes you happy or uncomfortable, feel you don't have the right to even put that out there, or you struggle with setting boundaries, that might jeopardize a relationship. And a lot of this stuff is actually unconscious and unintentional. But now that we've talked about it, we've put it on the table, and now it can become intentional. I'm now going to go to the video I talked about. I share this with people all the time. It gets right to the core of things. And I feel like when it's done, you're going to be like, I clearly get this, and I'm guilty of this. I can now see why this went wrong. I wasn't even seeing it that way. Or you might have seen it that way after the fact. So this video, like I said, is one I recommend to people all the time. It's from Online Life Guide. It was from their deep personal development piece that they were doing. I'm going to put it on MA.A in the podcast resource section so you can watch it. It's about 4 minutes or so. It's a worthy listen, and I legitimately feel you will get something from it. So take a listen to understanding the importance of setting boundaries.
Has it ever happened to you that someone seemed so amazing to you when you first got to know them, but later down the road, you found that same person to be annoying and frustrating? Have you ever wondered why is it that the same person with whom you seem to have good chemistry in the beginning, now things have turned quite the opposite? What actually happened? Consider this. When we overdo anything, we tend to get fed up. It is as simple as that. If you eat your favorite food 7 times a day for 30 days, you are going to hate it at one point, won't you? A similar thing happens when we get too centered on a particular person or a relationship and spend too much of our mental, emotional, and physical energy towards them. Most couples go through the quote-unquote honeymoon phase, which for many people seems to be over after just a few months. People would describe it as a loss of a spark in a relationship or losing attraction towards the other person. Let's consider an example here to understand what actually happens in our brain. Have you ever been so hungry that all you could focus on was that plate of delicious food in front of you? It had all your attention. The food seemed delicious and the aroma captured you. But what happens after you've had 2 to 3 servings of that same dish and your hunger is satiated? In fact, you have overeaten. Do you still feel attracted to it? Do you still enjoy the smell of that food when you've eaten too much of it, so much so that you can't even move? Does it still have your attention, or are you done with it? And now your mind is thinking of doing something else. It is the same food that captured your attention moments before, and now it doesn't even seem important anymore. In fact, you might want to move away from it. What changed? The answer is our neurochemistry. Now that our hunger is overly satiated, our brain is telling us to move on from it, and so we lose interest. A very similar process happens at the start of a relationship for many couples who don't keep a balance in their lives and relationships. Too much mental and emotional dependency messes with our neurochemistry, which shifts our feeling towards the other person. Another factor is that we humans have a tendency to change and mold things around us according to our liking and convenience. Just look at the world we have shaped according to our wants and desires. Now each individual has their own unique set of traits, values, likings and dislikings. No matter how close we are to another person and how many similarities we share, there still are a lot of differences in thoughts and opinions. When people get too close to each other and get too much into each other's personal space, they tend to have the urge to change the other person according to their own likings and values, and the differences then can seem annoying after a certain time. This can apply to any relationship, whether it be our love life, our family and friends, or co-workers. One of the major contributing factors in relationships going bad is too much unnecessary closeness. closeness to the point where people cross each other's personal boundaries and become clingy and overly possessive about each other, which ultimately leads to the loss of respect in the relationship. Every person needs some personal space. It is important to remember that we do not own anybody. Whether it be our spouse or even our children, we do not own them. They have their own freedom of choice and deserve to be treated as separate, respectable human beings. So, a simple key to maintaining love in any relationship is to set boundaries and respect personal space. It's crucial to set the foundation of our relationship on mutual acceptance, acknowledging and respecting the differences, and allowing each other space to breathe some fresh air.
So that's actually one of my favorite videos. I love sharing it with people because it's simple, it's to the point, and it really points out the fact of we can get so enmeshed in relationships and situations. It's like we just so absorb them. And even ourselves, we may cross boundaries, neglect things in our life that are important, like other friendships, and we get so absorbed, and all of a sudden for the other person, maybe it's too much, or maybe you start at that point. And it's interesting because that personal space is so important, and actually being able to strike that balance is even more important. And understanding your boundaries, or more important, somebody else's boundaries in these situations, can be the difference in having healthier and better relationships. So let's kind of move through our real talk time too. So if you don't have boundaries, or maybe you've never learned boundaries, or you don't know what a healthy one looks like, hopefully now you have these 6 domains to really stop and think about, what degree am I comfortable with people in this domain? Like financially, physically, spiritually. Where's my comfort? And how you determine that is, where do I get to a point where I've had enough? Where this is where I'm going to be like, this don't work for me. This is too much. This is too much. Please stop. That's your boundary. But it's more important to know the signs that you're getting too close to that line in the sand. And that's what people have to understand. Knowing your boundary, but knowing what becomes those, it's kind of like you're driving down the road, and if you veer off, you get that little, the grooves in the road that gives you that noise and that feeling in your car. If you happen to have dozed off or went too far off the line, you've crossed the boundary of now not being on the road. You need to know is, what are those grooves? What are those things in your life that will start to tell you, this is getting too close to where my boundary is. This needs to stop. And I think that it's key to understand that. Jason, thank you for waking in. It was a great video, especially during the pandemic when you are with your partner 24/7. Yes, this boundaries, especially during the pandemic, is so important because they were crossed without even trying to. That's the thing. We were stuck in a position where we were in the house all the time. Some people learned to reinvent themselves. Some people learned how to use that space appropriately. Some people got really clingy. People got tired of each other. That's why kids got to go back to school. We got to do this. We got to do that. Because the thing that people were clamoring for, remember, was everybody wanted family time. You probably don't have to say family time to anybody else for another 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years because they feel like they got their fill. Seriously. So understanding boundaries, especially in the pandemic, is key. And a lot of relationships went through some bad situations and breakups and some divorces because the boundaries got crossed. They didn't realize they were crossing them. So the key thing about boundaries is look at those 6 domains. Begin to understand, this is where I have my breaking point. This is where it's too much for me. And then I need you to understand what becomes those signs of being uncomfortable, that now you're getting too close to the boundary. So then you can stop before it gets to that point. Because the key thing is, especially about boundaries, is that most people don't know how to communicate their boundaries to other people because they feel like it's going to jeopardize them in some way or the relationship. Okay, again, if you feel like you can't express yourself because by saying what you need, not just want, is going to create friction, you might want to evaluate if that's the relationship that you should be in. If you cannot openly express what you need, not just want, because needs need to be met before wants come into the picture. Wants are just icing on the cake. Needs are everything you put to make the cake and have to bake it. So if you're not getting your needs fulfilled, chances are you're not going to be happy. And the wants won't even be as good to you. And it's a short-term satisfaction because the needs were not met. So how do you learn and start to build healthy boundaries? Okay, so here's something you can do to put this in practice. If one, you've struggled to know what your boundaries are, Or two, you know them, but you just aren't quite sure to what degree or where they really kind of stop. So, one, start by naming your limits. Figure out where you stand in those boundary domains, like I said. So, if it's, I don't like to loan money to people, but I definitely won't loan money to people who won't pay me back. So, if you've had an experience with somebody who you know will not pay you back, then you don't have to lend them money because you feel obligated to because it's a family member. No. And if they take exception to it, I'm sorry. The situation I talked about earlier, about the woman who was dating someone, they weren't married, they weren't even living together, they were talking about getting engaged, and he asked her for $10,000 because his mother had passed away. She wasn't comfortable giving him that kind of money because they didn't have that kind of relationship. Another topic, and I'll definitely bring back on Yanni to talk about this, is that there's clearly a confusion within our society to give spouse kind of exceptions and rights and privileges to people you're just dating. Your spouse and your girlfriend and boyfriend is something totally different. But people often blur those lines all the time and then get really upset when things don't quite go right. It was like, well, you gave them spouse privileges when clearly you haven't been committed that way. Unless you have an understanding in the scope of your relationship that maybe you both don't want to get married, but you are now in a committed relationship. You've made that decision collectively together. Not one person thinking this is what we're doing, but you've said it. That's a key thing that can really make boundaries complicated. Spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend. Spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend. Most people haven't thought about that. If you haven't, start thinking about it. So, know your limits within those 6 domains. 2, tune in to how you feel. Self-awareness. This is key. Know what makes you feel uncomfortable. That's the cue you may be violating or crossing a boundary. So when someone asks you about borrowing some money or using your car, and you know, honestly, they're not a responsible person, you just like want to say no, there's a reason why you want to say no. Not just because you want to say no, but you probably know that person is not responsible. So then you don't want to let them use your car because you don't trust them. Okay, it's your spidey senses going off. Danger, Will Robinson, danger. It's okay. You're supposed to think this way, and you don't have to negate that to accommodate them. You really don't. But you should explain why you don't. So if you're not a person who doesn't loan your car out, you don't have to change that for somebody else just because they need you to do it. Okay. 3, be direct, and this is key. Maintaining healthy boundaries requires understanding your communication styles and that of others. So if you're a passive aggressive, boundaries are always going to be difficult for you. If you're passive, it's always going to be difficult for you. People who are assertive and unfortunately aggressive tend to be able to express their boundaries. Like, I'm not doing that. Please, you can miss me with that. I'm 100. I'm just telling you, people who are assertive and aggressive don't struggle with telling you what they're not trying to do. The thing is, a person who's assertive does it in a better way because you shouldn't be critical or offensive in expressing what you cannot do for someone, explaining why. You don't have to be insulting. Some people don't know how to properly communicate. So people who are passive aggressive or just passive will really struggle with boundaries because they don't know how to express themselves. That's why that episode back there about communication styles, you need to learn what your communication style is so then you can begin to make a shift to make the adjustments so that you can express yourself. It doesn't mean you're going to be full-blown ever assertive, but you can learn better things to be able to address what your needs are in situations. 4, give yourself permission and be assertive. Acknowledge what you need and don't feel guilty because you need it. Then follow through on your needs. Be a self-advocate. Remember, a person who's a self-advocate is able to tell you what they need, how they need it from you, and can you give it to me? Now, if they can't, you don't get to be upset about it. You just have to look at that situation and say, am I asking them for too much? Would it cross their boundary? That's what it comes down to. So give yourself permission to have boundaries. Don't feel like because it's a spouse, a boyfriend, your children, that you can't say no because they're going to be upset with you or it's going to create friction in a relationship. My first thing is, when friction arises in a situation or relationship, why is it arising? Is it one-sided? Is it because one person's used to always having their way? They're offended by what you're saying. You have to figure out what the source of the angst is and address it. So if it's, I feel that, and I had to do this. I feel that every time I bring to you how I feel about something, you instantly get defensive. And I understand it's because I'm telling you that you did it, but I'm not accusing you of something. I'm talking to you about this because I don't feel it's your intention, but the outcome, remember the principle rule is that 20% of what you do has an 80% impact on the outcome. So I don't feel that necessarily you're doing this to offend me, but I'm offended nonetheless. Can we talk about this? Because this is making me uncomfortable. People often don't do well when they feel you're being critical of them. So how you set up a difficult conversation with somebody is really, really important. Often you have to say, I need to discuss something with you. You may not necessarily like the conversation, but it's really important to me because this relationship is important to me. So be assertive. Be a self-advocate. Don't find yourself standing down because you're afraid you're going to shake up the system, or you're going to make somebody upset by being honest about what's happening. And 5, consider your past and present. How were you raised? Roles in your family often have a lot to do with setting boundaries. Were you raised to be a caregiver? Often people who often took care of people in their family all the time have poor boundaries because they only know how to give and not to take, and they don't know how to say no, and they're often trying to fix things. And they'll fix things and give things at their own emotional and mental expense because that is at the core of who they were developed to be. I'm not saying you got to stop being a caregiver, but I also need some self-care to be in that caregiver. I need you to be a self-caregiver for real. So boundaries often come from the way that we're raised. If you were not taught to speak up for yourself, find that inner voice, by the way, that's another episode, then you will not be able to express boundaries properly. Reciprocity is a key thing about boundaries. I may not be able to get 100% of what I want in a situation, but as long as I'm not totally being relegated to being unhappy or getting nothing, I have to find a way to strike the balance. The word is reciprocity. And when you and another person are both working at understanding each other's boundaries, but you can meet me in the middle. And what the key thing I said last week, the whole thing about meet me where I'm at, I caution people on that, because if meeting you where you're at means I got to take 10 steps backwards, the question I have to ask myself in taking those 10 steps backwards, is it appropriate for me? Is it harmful for me? Is it beneficial for me? And for doing this for you, do I feel this is something is for the greater good of this relationship, that this is something so solid, it's worth the sacrifice of me moving backwards because you're at this space, but maybe I'm emotionally ahead of you or mentally ahead of you in the work I've done with myself. Before you decide to jump backwards, make sure that you're not jumping off a ledge. And most people don't, because we love to say these little catchphrases like, meet me where I'm at. Well, be careful. Keep people in your life that they're kind of standing in the similar space where you are, and it makes it a little bit easier to navigate that conversation. Not that I'm trying to be mean about it, but it's true. So here's my final thoughts on this. Understand we don't mean to undermine good intentions, but when we don't place them in a proper perspective, meaning boundaries, then our needs will not get met and we can't maintain them. Boundaries are a large part of that process. Understanding what you need, understanding what you want, but understanding how far you'll go to make sure those needs are met or wants without becoming uncomfortable or being emotionally or mentally unsafe. I'm okay with stepping out your comfort zone. I'm talking about crossing those boundaries. I want to make sure we're clear about this, that compromise you emotionally and mentally. Those are the dangerous, and financially, spending money in ways that's not healthy. Seriously, things that have unhealthy outcomes. There's a little bit of risk to everything in life, but that risk should not negate everything you've attempted to establish unless you believe the outcome is so great, it's going to do something so amazing for you, you're willing to take that leap of faith. Because faith is that thing that you never know exactly where it's going, but you believe the outcome is totally worth it and it's going to be beneficial for you. So start small. That's the key thing. Start small. Understand your boundaries. Discover them if you don't know what they are. And maybe you had some boundaries, but maybe now you reflect on this and update them, because as we grow, change, and mature through life, as we process through the lifespan, we have come to understand that ultimately our needs change over time. So your boundaries may change with your needs from being 20, 30, 40, and so on. And that's perfectly okay. It's a natural shift. You just have to be okay with that shift when all of a sudden the need looks different than it did. You were married and now you're divorced and you're like, wow, I've got a different need. Be comfortable with that because you've probably grown and changed in some way. So start small when you're building your boundaries and discover, learn, and then adapt accordingly. But always know when it gets to be uncomfortable, what that means about that boundary that maybe you've crossed or you're about to cross. Those are key things. Very, very key things. So that's the final thoughts for the show today. As always, everybody, thank you for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. Make sure you listen to previous episodes of Maya at MA.com. Go to the podcast resource section. I will repost that video, and there'll be some other supplemental things there you can read in regards to boundaries, learning how to set them, identify why you struggle with them. Make sure you also subscribe. Call to action. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just search M.A.Y.A. You're going to see a lot of anime first, and then at the bottom of all that, you'll see me. So go ahead and click that subscribe like button. Make sure you share my episodes with people. You can always find episodes of Maya outside of MayaAkai.com. If you have a platform of choice, you can go to iTunes, Google, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Audibles. You can find me on all those platforms. Just make sure you search Maya, My Ambition, Your Ambition in order to find that. That's all the ways you can tune into the show. So I thank you for tuning in. Until next time, everybody, as I always say, and this means so much to me, and hopefully by now, when I say this, it really resonates with you. Remember, this is so key. Your present becomes your past, and your future is no more. So live every day to the fullest, because it is so important. All right, everybody, we're going to end the show with one of Miriam's songs. She's not here today. She has a Easter break, so she's out doing that. Everyone deserves to get to have that space. So make sure that you follow Miriam. Miriam McQueen. You can find her on iTunes, Instagram, all those places. So make sure that you like her. Find her music on Instagram, download it, support. She's an independent artist. I happen to replay this song because it's called Breathe. And I think in order to be able to embrace yourself and to move to that next level, self-awareness, self-advocate, you have to learn how to give yourself space to breathe. So when I heard this song, it's one of her original songs, it really, really resonated with me. And hence I wanted to share it with all of you. So here it is, Miriam McQueen, her original song, Breathe.
You don't know how many times I've felt like I was crazy, never understood my mind, terribly terrified of losing all my sense, broken down so far it's hard to just breathe in. Sometimes I feel 10 feet tall, but most days I'm so short and small. My lungs just run away from me. How can I catch up if I can't breathe? One small mistake stretched out in time, moments I could have if I weren't lost in my mind. I'm tired of being tired, but not able to sleep. And when I finally fall, I'm taunted in my dreams. Sometimes I feel 10 feet tall, but most days I'm so short and small. My lungs just run away from me. How can I catch up if I can't breathe? Try. What is the use if you're dead inside? I need some oxygen. My fight or flight is kicking in. I can't go down this road again. You don't know how many times I've felt like I was crazy, never understood my mind.
Get inspired, get motivated with M.A.Y.A and the M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition podcast.
Something that I take pride in is trying to be forward thinking outside the box, challenging myself. And as I challenge myself, hopefully I challenge you.
Find M.A.Y.A on Twitter and Instagram at M.A.Y.A_Akai. On Facebook at M.A.Y.A Akai Presents.
We're going to talk health, wealth, fitness, mental health, financial, lots of different things that can empower you as you seek out the ambition that you're pursuing.
Or get everything M.A.Y.A at MayaAkai.com.